Friends, after 6 long years, I finally got to play Breath of the Wild. I've only gotten to play for about an hour, but I'm beyond excited to finally have gotten into it. While I can't say I'm a Zelda purist by any means, I'm still a huge fan. I have tons of excuses I could give you as to why it took this long, but it pretty much boils down to a huge backlog, a lack of time in general, and my son finally being old enough to play video games, so a lot of my spare time for gaming is starting to be spent teaching or watching him play more than playing myself. But before I played Breath of the Wild, I wanted to experience the original Legend of Zelda and what it meant to video games both then and now. Now, I had certainly played Zelda 1 before, but I had never sat down and diligently tried to get through it, even with a guide. Using the collector's edition on my GameCube growing up, I had at least gotten through the first dungeon, but no further. I was just absolutely crazy about Majora's Mask, and I would rather play that game over and over than just about anything else I owned at the time. I can even say I played Zelda 2 more than Zelda 1, just because I love the RPG aspects of it so much. But all of my experience with both 1 and 2 came with the aid of a guide, and I had never really sat down to play either of them without one, nor made it very far in general. Part of that is the lack of patience a 12-year-old would have with just about any challenging game when there were tons of instantly gratifying games on the shelf like the aforementioned Majora's Mask, or the Tony Hawk or Ratchet & Clank series that were really popular at the time. But as an adult, I've come to appreciate just how much the first 2 Zelda games did for game design and video games in general in their time. But they did so in 2 almost completely different contexts, and while the majority of Zelda games to follow went on to embrace and tighten up the linear foundation Zelda 2 laid out, Breath of the Wild has been praised for years for expanding and improving upon the open world concept of the original. The fanbase has often been split between just how linear they think a Zelda game can or should be. And while I say the series as a whole isn't necessarily defined by one or the other, I have always been fine with blinding linearity in 3D Zelda so long as the content along the way is of the quality you would expect out of a Zelda game. Ocarina of Time had the feeling of a vast world waiting to be explored, and while it certainly was exciting to experience all those locations around Hyrule for the first time, that excitement was tied at the hip to the infancy of 3D game design, and as such, many of the environments aren't as easy on the eyes as you may remember. But there is no denying that the dungeons and bosses, and mainly of the adult Link variety, rank up there with some of the all-time 3D Zelda bests. Majora's Mask took many of the things Ocarina did and made them both feel and look better. It had a much smaller overworld, but that overworld was packed with so many things to do, places to see, and people to talk to, all tied in with tons of side quests. Each corner of the map was just bursting with so much to explore and to revisit in the 3-day cycle, and Stone Tower Temple still stands as one of the greatest 3D Zelda dungeons to this day. The Wind Waker took on a whole new aesthetic. Link was expressive and more human than ever, but he was also as divisive as ever. Opinions on the visuals aside, I think one thing most players can agree on is the Great Sea was still kind of empty. Filling in each square of the chart eventually became more routine and less exciting as the possibility of meaningful side content dissipated as you progressed. But that doesn't deny the character the NPCs and environments had. Striking, bright, and vibrant may not have been for everyone, like me, but these things helped Wind Waker stand the test of time and age better than many more games at the time due to this choice in art style. But it only sold 60% of what Ocarina of Time sold at 4.6 million versus 7.6, and this does not include any of the subsequent remasters or ports of either game. Twilight Princess may very well be my favorite in the series. The stark contrast in tone and aesthetic compared to the Wind Waker was everything I wanted out of a Zelda game at the time. The combat was just varied enough to make it memorable. The dungeon count is the most of any 3D Zelda, and it doesn't dip in dungeon quality either. The visual style, while not aging as well as some and lagging behind its HD contemporaries on PS3 and 360, felt like the right choice at the time to recapture the fans that skipped out on the Wind Waker. And until Breath of the Wild, it was the best-selling Zelda game at 8.85 million across the Wii and GameCube versions. Skyward Sword may just be as linear as a 3D Zelda game can get. It married the art styles of Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, but it had even less going on in its overworlds. The game had lots of point A to point B traversal with a ruse of an overworld with skyloft and flying your loft wing to various holes in the clouds. The linear segmented portions of Hyrule were even recycled for multiple dungeons apiece. And the motion controls posed either a learning curve or inconvenience that many people simply didn't want to deal with. And while it could be more so tainted by the prospect of motion controls versus its linearity, the sales figures of less than Wind Waker prove that the 3D aspect of this series was at a crossroads. With Breath of the Wild, Nintendo went back to the roots of the series. The exploration of Zelda 1 was unmatched at the time. It represented possibility, innovation, and the want to exceed an unreachable limit. Those of you with the utmost knowledge of Famicom and NES games, or at least action RPGs of the time, will probably know that there are a few games here and there that had some aspects of what made Zelda great as part of their core gameplay, like Castlevania, which released after Zelda in Japan but before Zelda in the US. But Zelda was the full package. There was nothing completely like it at the time, or at least nothing like it that was quite so revered. I wanted to experience that as much as I could before playing Breath of the Wild, and to do so without a guide, just like someone would have in 1986. The modern opinion of Zelda 1 is that it was completely open and non-linear, giving you little to no resource as far as where to go and what to do. But I found that only to be partially true. See, the game came with a manual that was extremely informative and helpful, as well as a map that came with roughly 3/4 of the map filled out. With that map being filled out, there were dungeons, secrets, and caves for you to explore. The manual even gave you specific directions to the first 2 dungeons, or labyrinths as they were called here. And don't get me wrong, the manual helps plenty of obtuse secrets that are either intentionally vague or poorly translated from the original Japanese, but the basis of it is to truly aid the player in their quest, and it does that. And manuals are something that, while not non-existent at the advent of 3D gaming where I grew up, were definitely being phased out or at least made less and less relevant as time went on. But games in the 80s on Sega Genesis and NES and SNES relied so much on manuals to either provide story or context to the player's actions, or, like in Zelda's case, give extremely important information as far as the how to, where to, and why behind so much of the game's designs or the player's actions. There really is a lot of content to read through in the manual for Zelda 1, and I highly recommend you check it out. But to talk more about my experience with the actual game, I was able to make it over halfway through the game and dungeons without a guide of any kind. But combat really did become an issue at that point. Like many Zelda games, the quality and quantity of enemies increases with each dungeon. But the sword combat here really hampers your ability, and for me, also the experience. In 2D Zelda, from A Link to the Past onward, Link has a sword swing with at least a slight area of effect as well as diagonal movement. But not in Zelda 1, and it makes things very difficult in the latter portion of the dungeons. You only get movement in 4 directions, and your attack is only a jab with very little range. You can use various items to aid you in combat, but you can only spam bombs for so long before you run out, and certain items aren't effective toward later enemies in the game. And to be specific, this becomes particularly difficult when you are constantly encountering Dark Nuts and Wizrobes, over and over it seems. One other thing that surprised me about the game was there was still some of the basic item-based progression gating that you get in basically every Zelda game. You can't navigate a small portion of the overworld or would be stuck at various points in the latter half of the dungeons without the ladder. So as non-linear as it's claimed to be, and in part rightfully is, you are ultimately funneled toward completing a few dungeons and obtaining a handful of items like the raft and ladder before completing the later dungeons. There are also tons of secrets, and like with most games of the time, some of them are incredibly obtuse. There are substantial rewards in the overworld behind some of these, and those can drastically affect your chances of persevering later on. Using my most basic resources, like the manual and even some hand-drawn maps and notes, I was able to get up to, but stuck at various points in Dungeons 6 and 8, and had to look up the location of Dungeon 7. The combat really did get to unforgiving levels toward the end, and after much failing against Dark Nuts and Wizrobes, I ultimately decided to stop subjecting myself to it. I had experienced what made the game great and just how innovative it was for the time. I had learned what I wanted to learn, but I just couldn't find the want or maybe even the how to finish the game. While looking up the answer to where a dungeon entrance is or if there's a secret room in a certain dungeon is one thing, but literally being able to persevere in some extremely challenging combat toward the end, while obviously many people have done it over the decades, was just something I just really couldn't subject myself to anymore, and ultimately I was ready to play Breath of the Wild. There's a lot to unpack there, and I actually wrote a 17-page script over my experience and recorded voiceover for it, but I ultimately just wasn't sure of the quality. I got admittedly burnt out and frustrated toward the end, and I just didn't feel confident making an entire video out of it with the risk of sacrificing that quality, and I was just really ready to play Breath of the Wild. At the end of the day, Zelda 1 was a huge deal for video games on both the consumer and developer side. And while I think every fan of the series should at least try it, I think there is a reason you don't see tons of videos over it like you do with basically any game from A Link to the Past and after. It genuinely has not aged well in the combat department in my opinion, but the essence of exploration and the adventure it was at the time is absolutely still there. Miyamoto poured his heart and soul into this game, and its mark on the world of video games is undeniable. The sense of wonder and exploring a vast, limitless world has not been completely captured throughout the 3D Zelda series. There were plenty of sprawling epics like Ocarina, Majora's Mask, and Twilight Princess, and there were attempts at an open hub world with The Wind Waker and kind of Skyward Sword, but none of these comprehensively captured the explorative spirit the original Zelda was built on. Enter Breath of the Wild. The name says it all, and its legacy says even more. This game has very likely set the precedent for what the series will have to look like for many entries to come, and I cannot wait to share my experience with you all after playing it for the first time.